Going to go to our guest here in a second, but I wanted to hit on a couple of headlines on the same topic. These are up on Infowars.com. Murders in Sweden up 80% in 2 years. That's right. The liberal basket case of Sweden that we so often pick on is still enjoying its cultural enrichment. Sweden, which again, I believe is what, 8-9 million population, is likely to get around 160 murders this year. That compares to 115 murders last year and only 87 murders in 2014. Now, could that be connected to the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Muslim migrants that they've been importing over the last 2 years? Surely just a coincidence. You look at neighboring Norway, which had in comparison just 23 murders in 2015. So a massive disparity. Murders are on the rise in Sweden. We've got areas of Sweden like Malmo being described as war zones. You've got Somali immigrants saying they want to go back home because it's safer in Somalia than it is in some areas of Sweden. We have another headline: Sweden bans Christmas streetlights to avoid offending Muslim migrants, ? Of course, the authorities claim that they've banned Christmas streetlights in all these towns and cities for safety reasons. It's got nothing whatsoever to do with offending the tens of thousands of Muslim migrants who have poured in. People aren't buying that explanation. So we're talking about Sweden, and now we're going to go to our guest who has been on the show before. He's the Angry Foreigner. That's his moniker on YouTube. You can search for that on Twitter as well and find him. And he's a Bosnian immigrant living in Sweden who, as I said, has built this very popular YouTube channel, thanks in part, and it's very rare to have this in Sweden, or in fact in many places in Europe, due to his willingness to tell the truth about mass uncontrolled immigration. And he put out a video yesterday, which I posted on Twitter, which we're going to get into in a second. But first, to set the scene, I mean, I've got friends that visit Sweden on a regular basis, every month, specifically Malmo. The stories they tell me are horrific. They're saying it's far worse than the media is reporting. They're talking about it being a common occurrence for people to walk down the street and just hear firebombs going off. We've seen reports of cars set on fire, sometimes dozens a night. We've seen, according to them, ISIS flags being flown at Islamist rallies. So they walk past a protest and they're literally flying ISIS flags at these protests, not in Raqqa, not in Mosul, in Sweden. You know, they just legalized the ISIS flag in Sweden. We've got people now in Sweden, in Malmo, imposing self-imposed curfews because they're afraid of what's happening. Migrants harassing women on the street, reports of sexual assaults at these music festivals that the authorities, again, are trying to keep under wraps. Now, obviously, you know, it's worse in some areas compared to others, but I want to ask the Angry Foreigner who joins us now, you know, how does the media's reporting and what we learn as outsiders fit with reality? Are these problems actually a lot worse than what they're saying, than what they're reporting?
Well, I like to say that since the last time we talked, things have gotten both worse and better. What's worse is that we're seeing more of the same old issues. I mean, there's stories about a new migrant rape almost on a weekly basis now, and bathhouses and music festivals have basically become unsafe places for women. We're seeing a new type of sex crime where migrant gangs team up and molest women. What's changed for the better, though, is that the mainstream media has actually finally started reporting more on these issues. And that changed around the time of the New Year's Eve's attack in Cologne, Germany. It's like all of a sudden the taboos disappeared overnight. It became acceptable to criticize the view of women in foreign cultures and immigrant-related crime. And there's been a bunch of debate articles about that by established people and established media outlets. So I feel like there's an overall change for the better in the social debate about these things. It's more okay to talk about it now, and people are even more fed up with the racist label. But we're far from perfect. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that isn't being covered, and as usual, you have to go to the alternative media to get the, to get the full picture, so to speak. And what happened on Gotland recently with the wheelchair-bound woman really goes to show that we're far from perfect.
Yeah, let's get into that again. Another harrow. You said basically one rape per week now. We post the stories routinely. We had this harrowing incident, a woman in a wheelchair gang raped by migrants. Explain what happened and then the fallout from that afterwards?
Well, basically, she was visiting a restaurant in the evening, and she shared a cab home with a migrant. From what I understand, she didn't know him personally. And when she arrived, she asked if she could use his bathroom. You know, what ended up happening is that 5 migrants raped her for hours on end in that bathroom. They took the wheelchair away from her, and when she was finally able to escape, the first thing she did was call the police. But what happened then was that they took them into custody for a hearing, but released them shortly after because the prosecutor didn't feel like the woman's story was robust enough, and he didn't feel that she fought back enough. So they were released out of custody.
This is a woman in a wheelchair, and they're saying she didn't fight back enough.
Yeah, despite the fact that she had documented injuries. So naturally, people became absolutely furious, and a demonstration took place. And the purpose there was just to protest the decision to let these suspects go and to show support for the women. But what ended up happening after that is that every magazine on Gotland labeled them as Nazis, and the mainstream media in Sweden as well labeled them as Nazis as well. Basically, it was a huge smear campaign against these ordinary citizens who they weren't even politically aligned in any special team. They just felt it was messed up. And also, the Feminist Party and the Left Party on Gotland arranged a demonstration against racism and sexism because they didn't like the enticed debates online, the angry reactions. They wanted to protest that.
So you had a defenseless woman in a wheelchair being gang raped by migrant men, and the feminist response was to come out and slam people who were upset about that, not to actually defend the defenseless woman, right?
Yeah, it's terribly perverse. I mean, they did not focus on the victim at all. These people call themselves women's rights activists, and they didn't focus on the women. They just used the events to advertise some political point about how Sweden is racist or something. One of the spokespersons for the Feminist Party said something along the lines that this isn't an issue of immigration or culture. The problem is the destructive male norm, and the perspective that Swedish men need to protect Swedish women is part of the problem that creates rape, so to speak.
This is what we saw in Norway as well, because, of course, they haven't had anything like the same level of problems. But again, there was problems with migrants raping women. They came out and blamed it on Nordic drinking culture. It's all about men. It's not about a belief system where they literally have a game called the rape game. I would argue that was the problem, not the gender of the people carrying this out, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, Norway did something great when they introduced basically consent classes for everyone who's a newly arrived immigrant. It's not a perfect solution, doesn't fix everything, but it's sure a step in the right direction. Whereas in Sweden, such a suggestion to even suggest it is racist. It's ridiculous.
Now, again, the stats that we last had, and I think this was from 2014, rapes have skyrocketed by 1,400% since the mid-70s. And again, the left tries to say, oh, well, they changed the definition. Well, fine, but still there's a massive problem. They've got the second highest number of rapes in the world after Lesotho. 77.6% of the country's rapists are identified as foreigners. That number's probably higher now, given the influx over the last 2 years. I mean, this is clearly a problem, right? I mean, how can they deny that this is a problem when we see these stories every single week? And again, you talk about the music festivals. That came out that the police, they admitted they were covering that up so as not to give a boost to the Sweden Democrats, which is the anti-immigration party. So there's clearly a political objective, not only to cover up the terror attacks, the low-level intensity violence, the firebombings, but these rapes, because, again, the political establishment doesn't want Sweden Democrats to use this to get ahead in the polls.
Yes, exactly. And the thing is that I don't recognize the 77% number, so I'm not sure about that. But the thing is, Sweden doesn't actually carry out any statistics or research on perpetrator ethnicity anymore. They did back in 2005, I believe, was the last time. And what they found was an overrepresentation. And what I found come across myself from various articles and statistics, I mean, there was the biggest prison in Sweden for rapists. Half of the perpetrators couldn't go through treatment because they needed interpreters. So obviously there's a big overrepresentation. It's a big problem. And I'm sure that, people feel more comfortable to press charges nowadays, and the definition changing plays a role, but we cannot dismiss the role of immigration as well. So I feel like there's not much nuance to the debate here.
Now, let me read this out of the Express. They reported, when this first cropped up about 6-8 months ago, people again thought it was a hoax. They thought it was a fake story. Lund County in South Sweden is now considering giving jihadi defectors, that's ISIS fighters, incentives to reintegrate into society. The mooted benefits or housing grants help to re-enter the workforce and free driving licenses. So you've got actual jihadists, ISIS fighters coming back from Iraq and Syria. They're not turning them away at the border when they try to re-enter Sweden. If they do enter Sweden, they're not deporting them. They're giving them benefits and driving licenses and trying to reintegrate them into the workforce. I mean, at what point does al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, just, get on a plane to Sweden and declare it an ISIS caliphate? I mean, would he be welcomed at this point?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's crazy because they wouldn't do this with Nazis during the Second World War. They wouldn't do this with SS soldiers. It's crazy how just because these people are immigrants or Muslims, then we're supposed to pamper them. And this isn't anything new, actually. I mean, this story broke out recently, but I remember about 6 months ago, Stockholm suggested the same thing. And before that, Örebro suggested the same thing. I don't know if they're actually doing it. It's a suggestion. But I do know that one town actually had a jihadist having an internship at some place. So it wouldn't surprise me if it were to be put into effect because, well, nothing surprises me at this point, to be honest.
I mean, I wrote a story about, I think it was a year ago, Swedish immigration officer exposed as jihadist sympathizer. This was somebody actually within the government liking ISIS posts on Facebook. You had Sweden's top Islamophobia expert go and join ISIS. So you've got even people within the government now. But again, the point we emphasize over and over, and this is what interests me, there was a video that came out of Germany last week where they spoke to immigrants who had been there, for 20, 30, 40 years. And they said, and this is what I hear from everyone, including in France, where my mum teaches English and speaks to a lot of people who say the same thing. This is a new breed of migrants, unlike anything before. So these German migrants were on tape, and yeah, we've always had immigration, and sometimes they don't integrate, but normally in the past they would keep themselves to themselves. It wouldn't be a huge problem. But they were on tape saying, since these new migrants have come into Germany, these migrants who have been there for 20, 30, 40 years, they have food stalls, they have businesses. They're saying, we just don't sell anything anymore. They don't buy from us. They bring in their own alien culture. We've integrated. They don't integrate. And it was the long-term immigrants in Germany that were calling for them all to be deported. So again, that nuance is there, isn't it? This is a new breed that's unlike anything we've seen in the past 30, 40 years in Europe.
Well, exactly. I mean, I've seen immigrants become very, very worried. They live in the ghettos, and they notice that the radicalization has become far worse the past 20 years or so. And I think a big issue here is, which isn't talked about a lot, is Saudi Arabia. I mean, they're funding the building of mosques all over the world, and then they send their preachers there to preach Wahhabism, which is the most radical interpretation of Islam. They're basically sending preachers all over the world to radicalize the Muslim population. And this is never talked about, really. So you need to look at that there, too.
Now, I mean, we heard about this proposal back at the beginning of the year to deport 80,000 failed asylum seekers. You've got the Swedish Democrats rising in popularity. Has that process of deportation actually been happening? And do you see any kind of solution in the Sweden Democrats as a way of rolling back some of these policies that have caused this mass uncontrolled immigration?
Well, last I checked, it's basically not possible. I mean, 50,000 migrants, I believe, or maybe it was 80,000, were rejected, got their asylum application rejected. And only a small portion of these were successfully deported. I mean, most of these people go underground. And some of them, if they are deported, they just catch a train ticket and go right back to Sweden. So, I mean, it costs a lot of money and it doesn't have much effect. When it comes to Sweden Democrats, they have, in a sense, changed. I mean, they're not an accepted party. They're the third biggest party, but nobody wants to negotiate with them. But we can see this over time, that they have made predictions that turned out to be true, and ideas that they suggested are now basically implemented. I mean, Sweden is now finally considering doing age tests of refugee children, who often, I mean, most of these guys look like they're 25, 30, 40. So there's a big scam going on here. Recently, we implemented border controls, which severely reduced the levels of immigration. So, you know, even though people don't want to admit it, the Sweden Democrats have changed politics.
And again, that's where that pressure is needed. If you get an increasing number of the population at least just signaling their support for the Sweden Democrats, then again, it can cause the controlling parties to change their behavior. Of course, you had Merkel come out a few days ago and say that singing Christmas carols would be a good way to reassert Christianity in Germany after what she's done in importing, you know, this Islamic wave. I mean, the fact is, Hillary Clinton wants to import 65,000, quote, migrants or refugees. That's just a starting number. And, you know, we're being told by the media. In fact, you had ads in Sweden where it was like a woman in a hijab saying, this is the new reality. Sweden is now a safe refuge for migrants. So they were basically saying Sweden is no longer an individual country with its own identity. It's just a refuge. It's basically a giant migrant camp for these, quote, refugees, many of whom aren't even refugees. How do you think Swedes feel about that when they see those kind of ads on television?
Well, most Swedish people actually, even though they don't express it, they do believe in common sense. They do believe that Sweden should be Swedish. They do believe in the concept of when in Rome. I mean, Swedish people wouldn't move to Saudi Arabia and demand that they legalize porn and alcohol. So, I mean, I don't buy that multiculturalism is. I mean, our politicians and journalists try to push it on the population, but I don't think that the population wants that. I think they want their culture to be their culture. So,
okay,
and we're seeing.
We'll be right back with the final segment of the Alex Jones Show and the Angry Foreigner. Stay tuned. We'll be back. Okay, we're back with the Angry Foreigner, who is a Bosnian immigrant living in Sweden. Again, final comments on this situation. Again, we've got them banning Christmas lights now. They say it's for security purposes. I'm sure it has nothing whatsoever to do with avoiding offending Muslims. We've got murders skyrocketing, rapes on a regular basis, cars, businesses being firebombed. This is the European socialism that Barack Obama endorsed, that Hillary Clinton wants to continue. The Angry Foreigner, just final comments here, and tell people how they can find your YouTube channel and your Twitter.
Well, first of all, 70% of the Swedish population want to decrease immigration. So people are fed up. And what you're seeing with the politicians and the journalists doesn't reflect the people. They don't represent the people anymore. And I'm actually hopeful for Sweden's future, because we're seeing a growing resistance and we're seeing people getting sick of the racist label and more willing to speak up. So I'm actually hopeful. And if you want to check out my channel, just search Angry Foreigner and you'll come straight to my videos.